What's up, guys? Mark here at Metal Vibes, and today we're going to be talking about the New Orleans extreme metal band Goatwhore. Goatwhore were formed in 1997 by guitarist Sammy Duet of the famed sludge metal band Acid Bath. While Acid Bath's sound was generally sludge, but kind of had some other elements going on, Goatwhore's sound is more of a mix of black metal, death metal, and thrash metal, which is made for a really cool cocktail of styles that I think has garnered them some pretty positive reception over the years. The band would debut in 2000 with their first album, The Eclipse of Ages into Black. Now, with this album, they definitely leaned much heavier into the black metal compared to their other albums. The band's longtime vocalist, Ben Falgost, really just utilized kind of harsher rasps on here that wouldn't really be out of place on any Norwegian black metal album. On later albums, he would really show that he was a pretty versatile vocalist, but here he really just sticks with a pretty straightforward rasp, which is fine, but nothing particularly remarkable. Likewise, Sammy uses a lot of tremolo riffs that recall second wave black metal. He does use some kind of fatter chords that recall, I guess, a little bit of Acid Bath and also what Goatwhore would kind of start doing on their later albums. But I would say this is pretty much well entrenched in the realm of black metal. What's interesting about this album is that it's sprinkled with kind of these gothic sounding spoken word segments, and I guess Sammy performs those spoken word segments. They almost sound like something from an old Anathema or Draconian album. They're pretty cool, they're not badly done, and they're accompanied by some melodic riffing that's pretty neat. But I have to say, the way they're incorporated sometimes just feels a little random. It feels like they just kind of out of nowhere pop up in the middle of the song and don't necessarily fit all the time. And I think that kind of reflects one of the major issues I have with this album as a whole, and that's really the songwriting. The arrangements here, to me, just feel kind of confused. It feels like there's a lot of ideas here, but they're all just kind of thrown at the listener, and they don't always coalesce into really cohesive songs, and it doesn't really make for a very cohesive and interesting album to me. It's also a long album at about 45 minutes. After about 2/3 of the way through, I just feel like I've heard pretty much everything this album has to offer, and none of the later tracks really add any new elements or really do anything different enough to really keep me entertained. It's almost like they hadn't yet decided what kind of band exactly they wanted to be. This to me just feels like a very confused and weird album. I don't really enjoy it much. I would recommend it really only for curious listeners who want to know what Goatwhore sounded like in the early years. And not only is this not a good Goatwhore album, I really just don't think this is a very good album at all. Yeah, definitely my least favorite in their discography. In 2003, the band would come back, though, with Funeral Dirge for the Rotting Sun, their second album. That obviously is a cool album title, at least to me, and I think that kind of shows just in general Goatwhore have always had pretty cool album titles and song titles. Unfortunately, I would say the album title is probably one of the best and most interesting things about this album. It is better than The Eclipse of Ages into Black, but only marginally. Sound-wise, it's moved away from black metal a little bit. The guitars are a little heavier. Ben has started using some deeper vocals, and the songwriting has gotten a little bit more refined too. The track Blood, Guilt, Eucharist is pretty cool. It's got some chunky riffs that come up in the second half, and the spoken word that's incorporated into the song actually feels like it makes sense in the context of the song. Baptized in a Storm of Swords, that's a really cool track too, with some mid-pace riffs, a little bit of groove coming in, and again, spoken word sections that just feel like they make a little more sense in the context of the song. This is also a shorter album than the previous one, and it has an interlude thrown in, which I think is good to kind of give you a little break from what is a pretty oppressive sound at times. Again, though, on this one, the songwriting just doesn't stick out a whole lot. The songs are somewhat better written, but a lot of this album I just listen to and it doesn't blow me away. There's not a lot of standout songs, and I don't really have a whole lot to say. It basically just feels like a marginally more improved version of the last album that doesn't have as pronounced of a black metal influence. It's a decent album, whereas the last one was a bad album, but yeah, decent at best. I would put it just slightly above the previous album. It's marginally better, but nothing that blows me away. Somebody at Metal Blade Records must have liked Funeral Dirge for the Rotting Sun, though, because they did get signed by Metal Blade Records for their follow-up album, 2006's A Haunting Curse. This was also the first album produced by Eric Rutan of Hate Eternal fame, and he would also produce the next few albums in their catalog. The production here has a bit of a sharper guitar tone. Overall, the sound is a little bit cleaner, and I kind of like the sound on this album a lot. Some of the riffs on here feel pretty fat, almost got a little bit of a sludgy feel, which I think is pretty cool. But there's also a lot of thrash incorporated into this album, which I like. There's still some blackened riffs, still some crunchy moments, but everything just kind of feels like it makes a little more sense here and is done a little bit better. Ben starts to sound more like the Ben we know of today, with this garbled rasp and also some deeper vocals incorporated throughout. This is also the first album with drummer Zach Simmons, who is a terrific drummer and I think has played a pretty integral part in honing the band's sound, especially in their later albums. Unsurprisingly, given the new label and the fact that they had a great producer working with them on this album, this was, I would say, the band's breakthrough album. I've seen this album rated pretty highly by other people, and sometimes I do have to wonder if maybe that's because they're looking at it through rose-tinted lenses, since it is the band's breakthrough album. For me personally, this album, I would say, is nothing particularly special. The songs, particularly in the second half, aren't particularly notable. The closing track, I Avenge Myself, again, has a cool title, but it just doesn't feel that different from the other tracks. It doesn't really have just an epic feel that a closer should have. Even some of the better songs have issues. Alchemy of the Black Sun Cult is probably the band's biggest song from this album, and I understand why. It's got a pretty cool, like, groovy main riff, but it also has this really awkward transition about midway through that just always feels jarring to me. There's also a lot of vocals on this album. There's not a lot of times when Ben kind of steps back and just lets the guitar breathe. I would say that's kind of a criticism for me overall of Goatwhore. A lot of their albums have that feature, but on this album, I think, was really where I first started noticing it. That being said, this is once again an improvement from the last album. The opening song, Wear These Scars of Testimony, is pretty cool. It's got a kind of a black metal opening before it incorporates some thrashy chugs, and then a high register riff at the end. It's nothing I'd throw on like a workout playlist, but it's better than almost anything off their previous two albums. In the Narrow Confines of Defilement and Forever Consumed Oblivion are also pretty cool songs with these marching rhythms. And then the title track has this really cool tremolo riff that just kind of quivers with this really dark energy. Overall, this album has a bit of a varied feel to it. It's definitely got some more standout moments compared to their previous albums. It's a good record overall. If somebody gave this to me as a gift on vinyl, I wouldn't sell it on eBay. I would keep it. That being said, I wouldn't say it's a great album. Again, an improvement from their last album, and definitely a bigger improvement than the difference between the second and first album, but still nothing amazing, still nothing I'd rank that highly. Okay, the band would come back in 2009 with Carving Out the Eyes of God. This is what I would say is the first great Goatwhore album. I remember when this album came out, the general reaction that I noticed from the online metal community just seemed to be, whoa, check out the new Goatwhore album. It's actually pretty good. It feels like on the last album they found their sound, but on this one they really cleaned off the dirt and honed it to a finer point. And I think that's really apparent right from the start with the song Apocalyptic Havoc, which was probably the band's first real big hit, I guess, if you will. And it's easy to understand why. This is a great track. It's got a real simple but addictive riff. And then the chorus, or the second iteration of the chorus, has these awesome lyrics where Ben just goes, "Who needs a god when you've got Satan?" And awesome lyrics that are just begging to be slapped on the back of a t-shirt. There's other great songs here, too. The All Destroying follows up with some really muscular chugs. The song Shadow of a Rising Knife is really cool. It's got this rocking riff with these chords that just kind of slam you in the face. Provoking the Ritual of Death is a cool song, a little bit more of a swaggering tempo to it, and kind of a powerful tremolo melody. It almost reminds me a bit of like what a Mon Amarth would do. The closing track, To Mourn and Forever Wander Through Forgotten Doorways, another awesome song title, is a pretty cool song too. It slows things down a lot. It's got this cleanly picked opening, and then it's got these really sustained guitars and melodies at the end that just really make for a pretty interesting ending to the album. I get no complaints about the production here. I think Eric Rutan did another great job with this. The guitar solos on this album are also a lot more noticeable. And Ben, as always, sounds fantastic. He's really come to his own as a vocalist on this album, I feel like. The only issue I really have with this album is that the second half kind of tends to drag a little bit. I feel like the first half of the album is really notably stronger to me. But yeah, overall, I don't really have many complaints about it. I think it's a big step up from A Haunting Curse. And this really set the template, I feel like, for future Goatwhore albums. Yeah, really enjoyable. Wouldn't say it's their best, but definitely up there. I'll put it in second place for now, and we'll see how it shakes out. Okay, so the band would come back in 2012 with Blood for the Master. So, whereas the last album I felt was Goatwhore really hitting their stride, finding their sound, honing it, I feel like this album just really keeps that momentum going. To me, Blood for the Master just kind of improves in almost every way on Carving Out the Eyes of God. Once again, Eric Rutin does a great job on the production. The album feels a little bit more polished, but it still retains just a little bit of the band's grit, so it doesn't feel overproduced. And it's got a lot of great songs here. The opening track, Collapse in Eternal Worth, is really cool. It opens up with this really sharp black metal riff before hitting some fat, groovy riffs, where Steel and Bone Meat follows up, and that's a really cool song too. It's cruising along with kind of these beefy riffs. It almost sounds like a southern fried version of Hellhammer, which is really neat. Judgment of the Bleeding Crown is another cool song. It's got another melodic tremolo line that again kind of reminds me a little bit of something like Amon Amarth would do. And Embodiment of This Bitter Chaos, that's a cool song too. It has this pretty extended acoustic opening, which is nice. It kind of gives you a little break. And then it just cuts right in with this really catchy riff that could be from a rock and roll song. It's a pretty neat track. Yeah, the whole album just kind of barrels along with this energy. And the only real issue I have is, again, a couple of the songs in the second half don't always blow me away. Beyond the Spell of Discontent in particular is not the greatest song in the band's catalog, but overall, I think this album is fantastic. It's kind of a sleeper hit in a way, in that unlike Carving Out the Eyes of God, which had Apocalyptic Havoc, which was just a huge, notable standout track and a pretty big single, this doesn't have a whole lot of big hits, but it just feels like it's super consistent throughout. It's not an album that you listen to and you get blown away by necessarily at the first listen, but I think in the context of their discography, from listening to all their albums, this just feels like overall the best representation of what Goatwhore are as a band. I think they nailed it with this one, and I honestly love it more every time I hear it. I've seen this ranked highly by others, and I definitely have to agree. This, to me, goes in the top spots in their discography. Okay, the band would return in 2014 with Constricting Rage of the Merciless. This is an interesting album to me. Stylistically, kind of a continuation of the last one. Pretty even mix between the black death and thrash elements. It seems like they noted maybe that there was a lack of standout tracks on the previous album and tried to correct that with this one, because this has, I would say, some of their biggest songs on it. Particularly the song Bearing Teeth for Revolt, which I would say is my personal favorite Goatwhore song. That album is just a speed metal celebration. It's super fun. It's a freaking crowd pleaser. It's got these crunchy riffs that kind of remind me of Toxic Holocaust. These really catchy vocal lines during the verses, and then a really catchy chorus too. Everything here is just really catchy. It just feels like hook after hook on this song, just all strung together really nicely. FBS, which stands for Fucked by Satan, is another amazing track. This is just a speed metal banger. That main riff is one of my favorite things Goatwhore has ever done. I cannot get enough of it. The song just kind of cruises along on the energy of that main riff, and then finishes off with just this chant of "fucked by Satan," which just gets me every time. I love it. Schadenfreude is another really cool song. It almost sounds like a melodic black metal song, like something maybe Dissection would have done. Yeah, really cool track and a really unique track for them. Yeah, that said, there's some issues with this album that do bother me. I have mixed feelings in particular about the production. The guitar tone is really crisp and powerful, and the production overall I would say is good, but it also is just a little bit loud and overbearing for me, and it also feels just a tad bit sterile. Goatwhore, I feel like, is a band that just has this energy about them that really comes across in a live setting and also comes across on some of their studio albums. But with this album, I feel like it just feels just a little bit sterile. And I think that's particularly notable in the song Cold Earth Consumed in Dying Flesh, which is basically just a straight doom metal song. That song might work with a different production job, but here, with that clean production, it just kind of saps it of the atmosphere and makes for a song that feels like a real slog to me. It's not very interesting. Other tracks, too, just don't do a whole lot for me. Unraveling Paradise and Heaven's Crumbling Walls of Pity kind of just only survive with these sort of dissonant tremolos that are kind of interesting, but they're not particularly great. And both those songs are in the first half of the album, so you have, two songs in the first half of the album that just, are kind of middling to me. The opening track, "Poisonous Existence" and "Reawakening," is a cool song. It's got a really cool drum beat that I like that occurs right at the beginning and then later in the song as well. But compared to their other openers, this just doesn't really kick the door in the way those other songs do. Yeah, overall, this album is kind of a mixed bag for me. It's pretty backloaded. There's great songs here that I really love, but also a lot I don't really care as much for. And then combined just with the sterile production, it just makes for an album that I find hard to praise as much as some of their other works. It's still a really good album, and I definitely prefer this over their earlier stuff, but I would say only marginally. I loved this album when it first came out. This was the first Goatwhore album that I really kind of fell in love with. But upon re-listening to it in the context of their discography, it's definitely notable that it's not one of their strongest efforts. Still a very good album, but not quite as good as some of their other stuff. Alright, so the band would return in 2017 with the album Vengeful Ascension. This album was definitely a bit of a shift for the band, I feel like. Eric Rutan did not produce this album. The band said instead they wanted to go for a bit of a different sound and try to capture what they sounded like live. And it's definitely a noticeable shift in terms of the production. The overall sound here is a lot dirtier, the guitars are a lot muddier, it feels very unpolished, and Ben's vocals are pushed much more to the background. As a fan of less polished black and death metal albums, this kind of clicks with me more, the sound, but my overall feelings on this album are, again, kind of mixed. It seems like a lot of people tend to think of this as the most mediocre of their later material, and I can agree to some extent. I can definitely see the flaws with this album. Once again, the first part of this album just doesn't really blow you away. The opening track, Forsaken, is kind of neat with filthy tremolo riff, but it has just kind of this tired mid-pace to it that, again, just doesn't feel like it has the energy that an opener should have. It could have worked, I think, elsewhere on the album, but as an opening track, it just doesn't necessarily work, I think. Under the Flesh, Into the Soul is a cooler song. It's got a much snappier pace, a bit of a speed metal feel, and it's got this cool like call and response riff during the chorus that I really like. But yeah, overall, just not an amazing song. The title track, which follows that one, has a stomping rhythm, so it's kind of neat to get a bit of a different feel earlier in the album, but again, the pace and the performances here just feel a little tired. So 3 songs in, this album really just isn't blowing me away. But I will say, after a bit of a rough opening, this album definitely picks up momentum and actually turns out to be pretty enjoyable overall. The song Chaos Arcane is just a barn-burning thrasher that I really like. Mankind Will Have No Mercy, I think, is one of the band's best thrashier songs. It's got this really catchy staccato riff that just demands your attention. Abandoned Indoctrination is cool. It's more of a black metal song, and it's got this neat winding tremolo riff that I really like. And then the closing song, Those Who Denied God's Will, that's another cool track. It's got these epic, kind of almost symphonic sounding guitars at times that I think makes for a really cool closer. Yeah, overall, this album kind of has a similar problem as the last one because it's so backloaded. And you definitely have to work harder to enjoy this album, I feel like, especially with the production, which may not be to everyone's liking, and I think is a little bit of an acquired taste. That being said, I feel like the production does give it a little bit of grit and authenticity that just wasn't there on the previous album. This one overall is very close to Constricting Rage of the Merciless for me, but upon re-listen, I have to give it to Vengeful Ascension just by a little bit. This one just feels like it has a little bit more atmosphere to it, and I think that can largely be attributed to the production. Alright, and that brings us to 2022 with the album Angels Hung from the Arches of Heaven. This is the newest Goatwhore album, obviously, and their first after a 5-year gap, which is the biggest gap they've ever had between studio albums. Obviously, COVID delayed the release of this album. Apparently, this was recorded a little while back. Sammy talked in interviews about how he's really proud of this album and how he had a little bit more time to polish the songs and kind of get them to where he wanted them to be. And I think that's really apparent. There's a lot of really fun tracks on this record. Death from Above, which was released as one of the singles, is just a rollicking speed metal anthem. It's a lot of fun, just with these really catchy riffs that just barrel along. It even has an air siren effect at one point, which is cool, and then Ben just going, "Fuck you," at one point, which, yeah, it's just a real fist raiser. Nihil, which is the second to last track on the album, is another really cool song. It's more of a thrashy track. It's got a really wild solo and some crunchy riffs that I really like. The Bestowal of Abomination, which is one of the earlier songs, is a really neat track and a really unique track in the context of Goatwhore's catalog. It's got this cool echoing melody that almost reminds me of something you'd hear in like Dismember or a Swedish death metal band. The title track is really neat too. It's got this eerie and echoing clean picking, and it almost has a little bit of a sludgy feel at times, which is pretty cool. Victory is the Lightning of Defeat is another standout for me. This one almost feels like a cleaner version of like Celtic Frost's Morbid Tales or even Hellhammer. It just kind of barrels along with this really simple drum beats, but yeah, a lot of cool energy in that track. The closing song, And I Was Delivered from the Wound of Perdition, is I think one of the coolest closing tracks the band has ever had. It's got these absolutely massive riffs, this slow pace that just makes it feel monolithic, and it just builds up into this godly guitar solo that I just love. Yeah, the song as a whole is a little bit long, but overall, one of their best closing tracks. It's really great. As a whole, I would also say, though, that the album is a little bit long. At 47 minutes, this is their longest album. There's not necessarily any filler on here, but I would have to say some of the tracks, maybe on the second half of the album, probably could have been cut, and I think it would have made the album a little bit more concise and a little bit stronger overall. Weight of a Soulless Heart in particular is probably my least favorite track here, and I think that could have been cut without hurting the album at all. The production here has changed a lot from Vengeful Ascension. This has a much crunchier and clearer sound, more reminiscent of Blood for the Master. And yeah, overall, I would say this almost feels to me like a newer version of Blood for the Master. It's just another embodiment of everything Goatwhore does really well. It highlights, I think, just what a versatile and underrated guitarist Sammy is, and just what a great and versatile vocalist Ben is. This doesn't necessarily have the same huge hit single like some of their earlier albums did, but yeah, still a really consistent listen, and I would say almost more consistent than Carving Out the Eyes of God, to be honest. In terms of where I'd rank it, it's tough to say, but yeah, I mean, I think I would actually have to give it a higher spot than Carving Out the Eyes of God. It's just a little bit more of a consistent album. I think overall the songs are just a little bit better to me, even if it doesn't have that huge hit to it. Yeah, I think that's what I'll go with. Tough band to rate. A lot of their albums are really good and really consistent, and really any of their post 2006 albums I would say are worth checking out. A really consistent band, a really great band, and a great live band too that I would recommend anyone checking out if they haven't seen them before. But yeah, that's it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think of Goatwhore, how you would rank their albums, and if you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like, and I will see you guys next time. Stay heavy.